Ultracker Aleta S2C review, tutorial, and comparison. Are you looking for the best 360 camera for virtual tours? Do you want a virtual tour camera that is high resolution, very easy to use, and is reasonably priced? Then you may be interested in the Ultracker Aleta S2C, which may be the best 360 camera for virtual tours, up to around $1,200. But how good is the image quality? How easy is it to use, and how does it compare against other cameras? This is the Ultracker Aleta S2C. It's a professional 360 camera designed to take high-resolution 360 photos. I've been using it since August 2018, and in this detailed review, we're going to talk about who this camera is designed for. We're also going to talk about its specifications and its key features. Then I'll show you how to use it in a tutorial. Then we'll talk about its image quality and how it compares to 360 cameras and DSLR panoramas. Then finally, we'll talk about its strengths and its weaknesses. By the way, if you're new to this channel, FYI, it's about 360 and 3PV cameras. If you want to learn more about this exciting way to shoot your photos and videos, go ahead, hit subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell. So traditionally, virtual tours were shot with DSLR panoramas. You got a DSLR or mirrorless camera and you paired it with a panoramic head such as from Nodal Ninja, and then you took several photos and then afterwards you would stitch them together using stitching software. Now a few years ago we started seeing 360 cameras that made it much faster and easier to take photos. The problem is that the resolution and image quality wasn't nearly as good as the photos from a DSLR panorama. Is it possible to get the image quality of a DSLR panorama with the ease and convenience of a 360 camera? Well, that's what the Aleta S2C is designed to do. Does it accomplish this mission? Let's find out. Alright, so here's the Aleta S2C. It has 5 lenses, 4 around plus 1 in the zenith. Each lens has an aperture of f2.2 and it has 14 megapixel CMOS sensors, 5 of them. The photo resolution is 12K. It's 11520 by 5760. It can also shoot video at 4K, but the Aleta S2C's frame rate is limited to around 10 FPS, so it's really not for video. Now there is a more advanced model called S2, which will have a video resolution of 4K and 30 FPS frame rate, but that's not yet in the market. Besides photo and video, it can also take time lapses at 8K up to 2 FPS. The Aleta has full manual exposure with ISO ranging from 100 to 6400, and the shutter speed is from 4 seconds up to 1/32,000. Now 4 seconds isn't very long, but they're working on an update to extend the shutter speed to 720 seconds. It has removable batteries, 2 of them, and they're generic type 18650. They're easy to find online, and they're very inexpensive. Now let's talk about the Ultracker Aleta's features. Its key feature is real-time stitching. That means that when you take a photo, you don't have to stitch it in a phone or desktop app. It's stitched in the camera. And it does this with optical flow stitching, so the stitching is much smoother than some 360 cameras that don't have optical flow stitching. It also has an HDR mode. They call it WDR, but it's actually HDR. It takes a couple of exposures and then combines them, and the result is a photo with higher dynamic range than the standard mode. It also has another shooting mode which they call HDR, but it's actually an HDR exposure bracket with 3 shots. And if you prefer to use your own third-party stitcher, you can do that too. You can use the unstitched mode and you'll get 5 shots that you can stitch by yourself. Now let's talk about how to use the Aleta S2C. So the Aleta S2C smartphone app has both iOS and Android versions, and the way you connect them is a little bit different. So first, here's the procedure for the iPhone. So turn on your iPhone's Wi-Fi and turn on the Aleta S2C. When the Aleta S2C is fully powered up and you can see the standard the on-screen menu, go to your Wi-Fi and select the S2C's Wi-Fi signal. Tap on it, and the default password is 88888888, so 8 8s. So once it's connected, then you can launch the Aleta S2C app. And here it is. It's a little dim, but you can see the preview there. Now if you launch the Aleta S2C app on the iPhone and you don't see anything, even though you're connected wirelessly, make sure to turn off the auto reconnect on your other networks. Now let's learn to connect the Aleta to an Android phone. So for Android, this is going to sound strange, but you're actually supposed to turn off the Wi-Fi signal. So I'm going to go to my Wi-Fi, turn it off. So there. So with the Wi-Fi off, launch the Aleta just like with the iOS. So when you hear that startup sound, that means it's fully powered up. We're going to go to the Aleta app on the iPhone, or the Android rather. I'm going to launch it, and it's going to say Wi-Fi can't connect to the internet. Don't worry about that. And it should automatically reconnect Aleta. Now if it doesn't, then tap on this Wi-Fi signal, Wi-Fi symbol on the top right corner. Then you'll see this dialog box. Just press exit, don't worry, and here's the live preview. Now let's talk about the app itself and how to navigate around it. First, you'll see an equirectangular, and when you tap on this icon here, you can change the view to Tiny Planet or VR view. Below that is the mode settings, so you can tap on that and select whether you want photo or video or time-lapse. And if you choose photo, you can choose it. There'll be another sub menu that will come up that will let you choose between the standard mode, an HDR daylight mode, night mode, and an HDR night mode. So, but the best mode for me is really the exposure bracketing mode. Here's how to select it. Go to the photo, the mode setting, and then tap on this arrow over here, and you'll see two buttons. One of them is HDR RAW, that's for the exposure bracketing. The other one is just says RAW. It's actually not DNG RAW or anything like that. It's actually the unstitched JPEGs. So we're going to tap on HDR RAW, and that's it. Now on the bottom, you can also tap those three dots to reveal exposure settings. Another important setting is to change the self timers. So we're going to tap on this one, the settings, the one that looks like a gear. And then we're going to scroll down and look for shooting delay. So from there you could choose 0, 2 seconds, 5, 10, 20. I prefer 10, so I just exit that. And all that setting will be retained even when you turn off the camera. So speaking of turning it off, there are two ways to turn it off. You can either totally shut it down or put it on standby. And since we saw that the startup takes a while, I prefer to use standby. So to put it on standby, just tap on the power button, don't hold it down, and it's going to put it on standby mode. It's on standby. To turn it back on from standby, just turn on the power button, and it's going to power up much more quickly. So from here, just press the shutter and it's going to start counting down. So since I was in exposure bracketing mode, it will take 3 shots and put them all in one folder, and they'll all be stitched identically. So it's very easy to fuse them in with an HDR software. So as you can see, it's really easy to use the Aleta S2C, and because the settings are retained even if you turn off the camera, then that means that you can actually shoot without the phone, unless you really need the GPS data. So I compared the Aleta to 3 popular 360 cameras and the Panono. For each one, I used best practices. For the Panono, I used the HDR mode. For the Aleta, Insta360 One X, and the Xiaomi Mi Sphere, I used bracketing mode and Photomatics HDR. For Fusion, I used only standard mode because Fusion doesn't have exposure bracketing. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't I use exposure compensation for Fusion? Because if I did that for Fusion, then I could do that for the other cameras as well, then we'd never end. So I took photos in a scene with high dynamic range, and here's what I found. The camera with the highest dynamic range was the Panono HDR. Next was the Insta360 One X with a plus-minus 3 EV bracket HDR. Next, the Aleta S2C HDR bracket. And close to it was the Xiaomi Mi Sphere with a 2.5 EV bracket. Then finally the GoPro Fusion, which was non-HDR. But to be fair, if we were comparing only a single exposure at a time, Fusion would probably end up second only to the Panono. For resolution, from lowest to highest was the Fusion, Then the One X was very slightly more detailed than the Fusion. Then the Xiaomi Mi Sphere, which was slightly more detailed than the One X. Then there was a big gap to the Aleta S2C and an even bigger gap to the Panono. So far we shot some photos outdoors, but the real challenge is being able to stitch indoors, especially in small places, narrow spaces like small bathrooms. So we're gonna do that. Well, this is a typical hotel bathroom. It's very compact. So we're gonna try some photos here. Well, indoors I wanted to focus on the stitching. The three consumer 360 cameras had the best stitching. However, the Insta360 One X and the Xiaomi Mi Sphere had some issues with LED banding. For the One X, when they took the HDR bracket, the underexposure had LED banding, whereas the normal exposure and the overexposure did not. Now the Xiaomi Mi Sphere was the most susceptible to LED banding, with banding for both the underexposure and the normal exposure. This was surprising to me because the normal exposure had the shutter speed as low as 1/11 seconds, yet still had banding. Next was the Aleta. The Aleta had banding for the WDR mode, but no banding for the exposure bracketing mode. In terms of stitching errors, the Aleta had noticeable stitching errors in the nadir. It also had a broken image in one of the corners, which was within the Aleta's minimum stitching distance of 3 feet. Another corner had minor ghosting issues. As for the Panono, it had serious LED banding issues in HDR mode, but the standard mode did not have any LED banding. As for stitching errors, the Panono did surprisingly well in this particular test, with only a few ghosting issues. For resolution, the result was the same as for outdoors, except that Fusion and One X were very similar in detail. So how does it compare to a DSLR panorama? If you get a DSLR panorama with a circular fisheye lens with 4 shots, then the detail will be similar to the Aleta. Of course, if you use a fisheye lens with a narrower field of view, like a cropped fisheye, the resolution on a DSLR will be much higher than that on the Aleta S2C. The other factor is parallax stitching error. On the DSLR panorama, if you have set it up correctly, there shouldn't be any parallax stitching error. Then again, if you use a DSLR panorama, you have the nadir to deal with, you have the tripod there, and you usually have to patch it and take a separate nadir shot. With the Aleta S2C, if you use a monopod that has a narrow profile like the Bushman monopod, then the nadir can be very easy to patch. Remember, it's all in HDR, so it's super easy, one step, boom. Now let's talk about the Aleta's strengths and weaknesses. Let's start with the weaknesses. First of all is the minimum stitching distance. As I mentioned, it's got a minimum stitching distance of 3 feet. Compared to professional 360 cameras such as the Insta360 Pro or let's say Day 2 Max, something like that, this 3 feet distance is actually not that bad. It's definitely a shorter distance than let's say the Panono, which has a minimum distance of around 5 feet, and the stitching is more predictable than any professional 360 cameras that I've used. Moreover, when there are errors in the Aleta, they seem to be, a little bit easier to fix than errors from, let's say, the Panono. Another issue is dynamic range. Now there is the WDR mode, but like I said, personally, I'm not crazy about the way it looks. So for me, like using a third-party software and using the exposure bracketing mode is practically a must for the Aleta in order to have good image quality. Other aspects of image quality, the colors are a little bit unusual. It is susceptible to glare. And finally, there's a little bit of chromatic aberration. So all of those mean that its image quality is not like super high, not as high as, let's say, a DSLR panorama, despite having very good detail, but it compares very well against 360 cameras such as the Insta360 One X or the Xiaomi Mi Sphere. Now let's talk about its strengths. First of all, it's very easy to use. With one shot, you don't even need a phone. You can just press the button, it will start taking a shot, and it's so easy to use it and very fast. And because it has real-time optical flow stitching, the workflow is super easy. We also saw that it is very detailed as at least a low-end DSLR panorama. It's also very reasonably priced. It's currently around $1,200 and there's a special discount code. Check out the links in the description below. Finally are the firmware updates. The company is very aggressive about pushing firmware updates frequently. Their firmware updates have been coming as fast as almost like Insta360. Right, so now let's conclude. Should you buy the Aleta S2C? Well, that depends on what kind of virtual tours you want to shoot. If you want to shoot high-end virtual tours that have exceptional detail, exceptional image quality, then you're probably better off using a DSLR and a panoramic head. I've got tutorials for the Nodal Ninja here, check them out. On the other hand, if you want to shoot virtual tours quickly and with very high detail, higher than what's possible on the consumer 360 camera, then the Aleta S2C is a really good alternative and probably the best alternative right now at anywhere close to this price. I like the detail and I love the workflow. It's so easy to use and I think the price is pretty reasonable for what you're getting. So that's why I would recommend it for virtual tours. So what about you? Which do you prefer, image quality or workflow? Let me know in the comments. Thanks.